He said he loved me when he had nothing. Success changed everything. Part 2. The order from Mrs. Insabuga changed everything. Within weeks, guests at the hotel began asking where they could buy the candles that filled the rooms with such a unique fragrance. Visitors carried them home as gifts. Soon, luxury spas, restaurants, and wedding planners began requesting their own custom scents. The small candle business that had once been ignored was suddenly impossible to ignore. Julia understood that success was not only about making a good product, it was about creating a connection. She refined their branding, improved their packaging, attended business exhibitions, and built relationships with customers who believed in their story. People don't just buy products, she often told Donald. They buy emotions. They buy memories. While Julia focused on growth and strategy, Donald managed production, suppliers, and operations. Together, they built something neither of them had imagined possible. Their tiny rented room eventually became too small. Boxes filled every corner. Candle shelves reached the doorway. Friends volunteered during busy periods just to help complete orders. Soon, they moved into a proper workshop and hired their first employees, including young women from the same struggling neighborhoods they had once known. Julia treated every worker with respect because she remembered what it felt like to start with nothing. Donald admired her confidence. The same woman who once sat beside him making candles on the floor could now walk into meetings with executives and speak as an equal. Yet somewhere deep inside, an old insecurity remained. Sometimes, while watching Julia command attention in business meetings, Donald wondered if he truly belonged beside her. 3 years after Julia had carried 2 small suitcases into his tiny room, Donald returned to the Cato family home. But this time, everything was different. The old borrowed shirt was gone. The worn shoes were gone. He arrived in a luxury vehicle purchased from their company profits, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. Behind him came family members, respected businessmen, community leaders, and gifts prepared for the traditional introduction ceremony. Samuel Cato watched quietly from the veranda as Donald approached. Years earlier, Donald had stood there feeling like he had nothing to offer. Now he stood as a successful businessman. But when he reached Samuel, he lowered his head respectfully. "Sir," Donald said emotionally, "years ago I came here asking only for patience. Today I return asking properly for your daughter's hand. Everything I have brought cannot equal her value, but it represents my gratitude for raising the woman who believed in me before anyone else did." For several seconds Samuel said nothing. Then he embraced him. "My son," he whispered, "today you have not proven that you became wealthy. You have proven that success did not steal your humility." Julia watched from inside the house with tears in her eyes. She believed every sacrifice had finally been worth it. Their wedding became one of the biggest celebrations the city had seen that year. Newspapers praised them as the couple who built an empire from almost nothing. During his speech, Donald held Julia's hands before hundreds of guests. "When the world measured me by what I lacked," he said, "this woman measured me by what I could become. Everything I am exists because she believed before anyone else dared to." The applause lasted for minutes. Even Samuel wiped tears from his eyes. But unknown to almost everyone, Samuel had requested one final document before approving the marriage: a carefully prepared prenuptial agreement. It protected both Julia and Donald equally. It clearly stated that betrayal through adultery, financial deception, or abuse would have serious consequences. Donald signed without hesitation. "I'll never need this," he joked. Samuel smiled. "I sincerely hope you're right." For the first few years, marriage seemed perfect. Their company expanded into neighboring countries. They bought a beautiful home surrounded by gardens filled with roses and lavender. Julia gave birth to their daughter Grace, followed later by their son Daniel. Donald was a loving father. Every evening he rushed home to play with the children, while Julia watched proudly. Those were the years everyone called perfect. But perfection often hides the first signs of decay. As the company grew, newspapers increasingly described Julia as the brilliant mind behind the candle empire. Business magazines praised her creativity and leadership. Donald smiled whenever people celebrated his wife. But privately, something inside him began changing. It started with small comments. "They always mention your degree." "They think I only succeeded because of you." Julia always reassured him. "We built this together." But Donald was slowly hearing something different. At business events, wealthy men made careless jokes. "So you're the man who married the genius. Without Julia, you'd still be working behind that supermarket counter." They laughed. Donald laughed too, but every joke stayed with him. He stopped hearing admiration. He heard humiliation. The young man who once believed he was not good enough for Julia had never truly disappeared. He had simply become a wealthy man wearing expensive clothes. Over time, Donald began making decisions without consulting Julia. Risky investments, expensive purchases, secret partnerships. Whenever she questioned him, arguments followed. "I'm the CEO," he said. "So am I," Julia replied. He looked at her coldly. "But everyone knows whose name carries the weight now." "Our name," she answered. Donald smiled bitterly. "No, my name." The words shocked her. She reminded herself he was under pressure. She reminded herself success changes people. She remembered her father's warning. But she ignored the one thing Samuel had warned her about years earlier. Not poverty, not ambition, the wounds people carry when they never heal. And then Melissa entered his life. She was a young, glamorous event planner who knew exactly what insecure people wanted to hear. At a charity event, she leaned closer to Donald and whispered, "People don't respect you. They tolerate you because of Julia." Those words stayed with him, because they touched the wound he had spent years hiding. Soon, Melissa became the voice feeding every insecurity Donald had tried to bury. And slowly, the man Julia built with love began becoming the man who would destroy everything they had created. After Melissa entered his life, Donald changed in ways even Julia struggled to recognize. What began as private conversations and emotional distance soon became something far worse. He started having affairs with multiple women, carefully hiding his relationships behind business trips, late-night meetings, and excuses that became harder to believe. Melissa was not the only person occupying his attention. 3 different women became part of a secret life he kept away from the wife who had stood beside him when he had nothing. At the same time, Donald began making financial decisions without Julia's knowledge. Hidden investments, secret partnerships, and personal purchases drained resources from the company they had built together. The greatest betrayal was not the money or the affairs. It was that Donald had begun treating the woman who believed in him before anyone else as the person standing in his way. For months, Julia had hoped the man she loved was still somewhere beneath the anger, the pride, and the distance. She believed that if she remained patient enough, if she reminded him of the person he used to be, their family could survive the storm growing around them. But some storms do not pass. They consume everything in their path. One evening, after another late night away from home, Donald returned carrying the weight of a life he no longer recognized. The man who once rushed home to play with his children now walked through his own front door like a stranger. Julia had been waiting, not to fight, not to accuse him. She had prepared his favorite meal and placed something beside his plate that she believed might bring back the tenderness they had lost. A pregnancy test, their 3rd child. For a moment, Donald simply stared at it. Julia watched his face carefully, hoping to see the joy she had seen before when Grace and Daniel were born. But instead, something colder appeared. "Another child?" he whispered. Her smile faded. "Donald." He looked away. "Do you know what everyone says about me?" Julia remained silent. "They say Julia built the business. They say Julia gave me a name. They say Julia saved me." His voice became bitter. "I am tired of living in your shadow." Julia felt her heart break. "After everything we built together, you think I see you as less than me?" Donald laughed quietly. "No." He looked directly at her. I think you're above me, and I'm tired of pretending that doesn't bother me. Julia stepped closer. Donald, this isn't who you are. But those words only made his anger grow. Years of insecurity, resentment, and humiliation came rushing out all at once. The man who once promised to protect her became the man standing before her, filled with rage. Their argument grew louder. Their daughter Grace woke up and appeared at the staircase, frightened by the voices she heard below. "Mummy?" Julia immediately turned toward her. "It's okay, sweetheart. Go back to bed." But Donald was no longer listening. In that moment, the anger he had carried for years overcame the love that once defined him. He struck Julia. The room went silent. Julia stood frozen, unable to believe the man she had sacrificed everything for had become the person hurting her. Then he pushed her again. She fell, instinctively protecting her stomach. "My baby," she whispered. Those words finally broke through the anger for a moment, but the damage had already been done. Julia's scream tore through the quiet neighborhood. Lights turned on in nearby houses. Neighbors rushed toward the home of the couple everyone once admired. By the time they entered, the empire built from love had already begun collapsing. An ambulance carried Julia away before midnight, and before sunrise, Samuel Cato received the phone call every father fears. His daughter was fighting for her life, and the man he once welcomed as a son was the reason why. Samuel Cato never confronted Donald in anger. Standing outside Julia's hospital room, watching doctors fight to save both his daughter and her unborn child, he made a different decision. Justice would come through evidence, witnesses, and the law. After hours of treatment, Julia was stabilized. Though badly injured, doctors managed to save her pregnancy. When she regained consciousness, her first question was, "Where is Donald?" Samuel quietly told her he was under police guard. Julia closed her eyes, finally accepting that there was no marriage left to save. News of Donald's arrest spread rapidly. The businessman once celebrated for building a successful candle empire now faced allegations of brutally assaulting his pregnant wife. The company suspended him immediately, investors began pulling back, and the public image he had spent years building started collapsing overnight. As investigators dug deeper, Julia's years of silent endurance came to light. She had carefully documented Donald's affairs, hidden financial dealings, and countless betrayals. Not out of revenge, but because she feared one day she might need the truth. Former employees, drivers, and assistants stepped forward, refusing to remain silent any longer. Donald entered the divorce proceedings, believing he would keep half the company. But he had forgotten the prenuptial agreement Samuel had insisted upon before the wedding. The document clearly stated that adultery, domestic abuse, and financial deception would forfeit major ownership rights. Donald had violated every one of those conditions. Julia's legal team presented overwhelming evidence, not only of Donald's betrayal, but also proving that the company's vision, branding, marketing, and expansion had always been driven by Julia's leadership. The court dissolved the marriage. Julia was awarded primary custody of the children and later gave birth safely to a healthy baby girl she named Hope, believing Hope had survived even when everything else seemed lost. Donald lost control of the company, the family home, and most of the fortune he believed belonged to him. Outside the courthouse, Samuel offered only one explanation. "People thought I opposed Donald because he was poor. They were wrong. Poverty never frightened me. I grew up poor myself. What frightened me was unresolved bitterness. Wealth can remove hunger, but it cannot cure resentment. Only character can do that." Donald appealed unsuccessfully. His risky investments collapsed, creditors closed in, and Melissa disappeared the moment his wealth and status vanished. The friends who had encouraged his infidelity also disappeared, proving that relationships built on success rarely survive failure. Within 2 years, Donald was living alone in another tiny rented room. While unpacking, he found the first candle Julia had ever made for him. On the faded label she had written, "For the man who reminds me that light does not need wealth to shine." Holding the candle, he remembered the tiny room where they had started with nothing but dreams. Only then did he realize that the happiest version of himself had existed before money convinced him he had something to prove. Meanwhile, Julia slowly healed. Therapy, time, and the love of her children helped her rebuild a life that violence had nearly destroyed. The company continued to grow, creating thousands of jobs. She established scholarships for young women and founded an organization that helped survivors of domestic abuse start businesses of their own. Whenever people asked what inspired the foundation, Julia always gave the same answer. Financial independence gives people choices. Sometimes those choices save lives. Years later, during the company's 20th anniversary, Julia stood beside her father as their grandchildren played nearby. "I used to think you warned me because Donald came from a different world," she admitted. Samuel gently shook his head. "I was never warning you about his world. I was warning you about the wounds he carried from it. Some people escape poverty and become kinder because they remember every hardship. Others spend the rest of their lives trying to punish the world for making them feel small. Money simply reveals which person they chose to become." Julia finally understood. Her greatest achievement had never been helping Donald become successful. It was refusing to let his betrayal destroy the kindness within her. And somewhere else, sitting alone beneath the light of the last candle Julia had ever made for him, Donald finally learned the lesson that had come far too late. Julia had never simply given him success. She had given him a home before he had a house, dignity before the world gave him respect, and unconditional love before wealth taught him to value admiration instead. He mistook those gifts for debts. By the time he understood their true worth, the woman who had chosen him when he had nothing had become the one person he could never win back. That was the greatest loss he would ever suffer.